Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to It's Rainmaking Time. This is Kim Greenhouse. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Tim Ball, who's a renowned environmental consultant and former climatology professor at the University of Winnipeg. He has participated in our shows, the first climate shows that we ever did with Robert Felix and Joe Dalio. We invited him back to talk about peer review. We had a blockbuster show with him and Gavin Menzies. And the other day I was talking with Tim about the oceans. I had just completed a show on some things that are going on in the oceans with our Navy that had to do with the permission to kill off 11.x million mammals and natural habitats. And Tim started to discuss with me his work chasing Russian submarines and some deep level experience he has had in his work in the ocean and what goes on in the ocean with sonar and other types of impacts that we don't think about. He's also going to talk to us today about how important the ocean is as it relates to climate and how it impacts the CO2 that a lot of us are focused on. And we're just going to talk about all kinds of things, how it's easier to go to the moon than it is to go investigating under the sea. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Dr. Tim Ball to It's Rainmaking Time. Good day.
Good day. Thank you, Kim, and thanks for the opportunity.
Talk a little bit about what we talked about the other day. I learned a lot listening to you, and I'd like you to share about your work chasing Russian submarines. What were you doing? And give the context for the audience.
Okay, the context is, and of course there's always that question about, well, how is he qualified to talk about these things? He's a climatologist, and that's partly a reflection on something else we need to talk about, is that everybody's a specialist, but we live in a generalist world. But two things that I've done in my life. One was chasing Russians, or as they were then, Soviet submarines around the North Atlantic when I was with the Canadian Air Force. And I learned a great deal about the upper levels of the ocean, the area in which the submarines operate. And even though they're very sophisticated vehicles, that's a limited amount of the ocean because the depth crushes them once they get below about 1,000 feet. And in fact, the American government have spent enormous amounts of money building titanium, which is an enormously expensive metal, building titanium submarines to withstand those depths. And so I learned a great deal about that upper level of the ocean, the temperature structure of it, the sound transmission, and of course, one of the things that we used to do, and it was actually what made the job much more meaningful, was we would fly 18 and 20-hour patrols nonstop in a long-range aircraft. And in the middle of the night, we would drop a sound device that it was called a sonobuoy. This is a long tube that you threw it out the airplane. Vanes came up that span like a helicopter. And when it hit the water, the bottom plate flipped off and a microphone went down to whatever depth you'd preset it. And we used that, of course, for listening for submarines and listening for explosive devices that we dropped to echo back off the submarine. But we used them to listen to humpback whales as well. And one of the jobs that we did, they'll say, that made the job more interesting was that they taught us how to identify whales and the different species, and our job was to record them, the number in a pod and the direction they were moving and so on and so forth. So there were just so many fascinating things that I learned about that upper level of the ocean. And then once I got out of the military and lost my flying category because of a hearing problem, and I didn't want to fly a desk, so I went back to school. And because of that work, and then also because of flying search and rescue in the Arctic, which is another whole story.
I didn't know you did that. Every time I talk to you, I get more and more. I didn't know you flew search and rescue in the Arctic.
Yeah, I did 5 years of search and rescue right to the North Pole and all across Canada. And of course, when I started out, there was no GPS. In fact, just to tell you how primitive and how recent our knowledge of the world is, we used to fly up over Baffin Island and all of those places, and our maps had quite large areas that said terra incognita on them. Now, what that means is unknown land. And so this is in the 60s. So it tells you how recent we've been mapping even the surface of the Earth, and how little we actually know about the Earth, and we can talk about that with the oceans as well. But of course that got me learning about the Arctic climate. And of course the whole Arctic area is an incredibly fascinating area. But that got me into wanting to study weather and climate. So I went back to university. And there, of course, I discovered that the oceans were a very, very important part of the whole climate system. In fact, the interaction between the atmosphere and the oceans is an essential part of understanding how the weather changes and how the weather patterns develop. We can see that going on right now. For example, we've just coming out of an El Nino event, which is a large ocean current that influences the temperature around the world, and we're going into an El Nino, which is already driving temperatures down in the southern hemisphere. I mean, there are reports of below freezing temperatures in the Andes, in Bolivia, and so you get some idea of it. So the oceans, and particularly the upper levels of the ocean, are hugely important in understanding how the weather changes, and therefore how climate varies over time. So with all of those things coming together, it has led me to a tremendous interest in the oceans in total. And so that's the background for why I feel qualified to make some of the comments that things we're going to talk about today.
It's kind of disturbing that you have to lay that out in order to speak your experience and your expertise. But I'm glad you did it.
Well, of course, one of the things, Kim, is that it's a completely biased approach, because the skeptics are immediately challenged for their qualifications to talk about things, whereas people that are not skeptics are allowed to have all the views they want. And of course, the classic one is Al Gore, who sets himself up as an expert on climate and ridicules other people that dare to question him. And so, yeah, it's unfortunate, but it's a fact of, and in fact, it's a measure of how they've politicized these science issues, like the oceans and like the climate. And but it is necessary.
I want to go back to your experience listening to the humpback whales in our earlier conversation. I'm paraphrasing here, but you were speaking to me about the sonar and what happens to the mammals there and what they hear. And you were giving a certain perspective of something I thought was interesting. Can you talk about it?
Yeah, well, one of the ways you detect anything underwater is by sound. And of course, the whales and dolphins and other creatures that use the sonic method of detection, they send out a signal and then they receive the signal back. So they're very sensitive to sound, much like bats and use the same techniques. And so when we were trying to track down submarines, there were two things that we had to, well, several things, but two primary things was we learned that there were layers in the ocean determined by the water temperature. Everybody thinks that the ocean's temperatures are pretty well, just decreasing, warm at the surface and then decreasing with depth. Well, that's not the case at all. There can be multiple layers of a warmer layer and a cooler layer and so on. And one of the ways that the navies and I was in the Air Force, we determined this was by doing what was called a bathythermograph. And of course, that's simply a fancy term for graphing the temperature, the therm part of it, the temperature with depth. So you would drop a device that floated and sent down a thermometer, and as it went down, it recorded the temperature with depth, which you could then plot out to determine where the different temperature layers were. And of course, that then controls how the sound travels in the ocean horizontally. And just to give you an idea of how dramatic this can be, we could put down one of our listening devices, the sonobuoys that I talked about a little bit earlier, with the microphone down, and it could be above a layer of different water temperature, and a submarine could be just 80, 90 feet below that, yet you would never hear it. And yet on one occasion, and this was a particularly extreme example, but it's not that unusual, we were sent out to look for a Russian submarine that was apparently reported off the coast of Nova Scotia. And the way that they thought it was a Russian submarine was because everything that puts out noise has a particular signal to it. So if we were able to determine how many cylinders there were in the engine making the noise, how many revolutions the propeller was turning, how many blades there were on the propeller, a whole fingerprint of information about what was producing that underwater noise. So what we were told was that they were detecting on the coast of Nova Scotia what was called a dinky diesel engine, and these were known to be in some of the Russian submarines. And so we were sent out to look for it. And it eventually turned out that what they were actually recording was a dinky diesel, a Russian engine, or a Soviet engine as it was then, but it was in a Russian freighter leaving Liverpool harbor in Britain over 3,000 miles away. And yet here they were picking it up in this layer of temperature and sound under the ocean off the coast of Nova Scotia.
Remarkable.
It's remarkable. But
and important.
And of course, it's hugely important because, of course, if you think about how then, if you got concentrated noise and noise pollution for these creatures that are under the water and very sensitive to sound, how that could be a problem and misdirect them or cause them. It'd be almost like a sort of a water torture if you wanted.
Do you think that's why some whales are beaching themselves?
Well, I've always had that suspicion that certainly you see when they get into shallower waters, which is where the beachings begin. That it could be enough to confuse them sufficiently to beach or to even try and get away from the noise. I mean, it's something that we would do as an animal.
Absolutely.
Is to try and get away from the noise. Now, I have to say there are other possible explanations. For example, and we can talk about this with regard to the oceans as well, but all animals are very sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field. And Dr. Brown did a tremendous amount of work on this, on the fact that our brains have magnetite in it, which is one of the most sensitive minerals to magnetism.
I didn't know that. That's fascinating. I never knew that.
Well, exactly, and of course the argument is that, and it's now known, by the way, that pigeons, for example, they can navigate even if they don't see the sun, and it's because they're using the Earth's magnetic field. And Dr. Brown even suggested it's one of the reasons that if you're born in a particular area, and that magnetic field of that area is imprinted on your brain. If you move away from that, you never really feel comfortable. You never feel you're in your place. And there are parts of the world where there are dead spots or holes of magnetism. For example, there's one off the coast of New Jersey. And they know that when pigeons got into these areas, they were completely confused. And so the whole idea of magnetism and its influence on animals and on their sense of direction. And there are some arguments made that have, I think, some validity, that another part of the problem with them beaching themselves is that they get into areas where the magnetic signal they're getting is throwing off their sense of direction, and that's causing them to beach as well. But I think that basically what we need to say is that regardless of the cause, we need an awful lot of research done on this to track it down. And of course, for me, all of these things simply underline and underscore this arrogant idea that we know so much about the Earth when we know so little. And of course, that's part of why we want to talk about the oceans today, because we know less about the deep oceans particularly than we do about the moon or many of the other planets. And one of the issues with that, by the way, Kim, is that up until about 5 or 6 years ago, the estimates were that there were 20,000 species under the oceans. The figure now has jumped to 20 million. And and of course that fits in with our knowledge that we only have identified and named about 35% of all the species that are on the planet, land species.
The part that you shared with me was fascinating too, which is that Mount Everest is 29,000 feet high, and yet the deepest oceans are 36,000 feet below. That's just mind-boggling.
It's mind-boggling.
Isn't it?
Yeah, and as I said to you, the only person that I know of that's ever been down to that Marianas Trench was Dr. Picard in what he called his bath escape, and he was lowered down to that depth. And by the way, at that depth of water, with the water density, if you dropped a 1-pound steel ball, it would take 7 hours to reach the bottom.
Wow.
And so it gives you an idea. And of course, you can imagine that the crushing density of the water at that depth. And yet there are creatures living down there. And this is what's so amazing. And of course, another example, we've always argued that you need sunlight to have life. And yet suddenly they discovered these plumes of heat coming out from the underneath the oceans, and we can talk about that as well, where water temperatures of between 400 and 700 degrees Celsius, and yet there was life there that was living off the heat and the sulfur that was being produced. And as far removed from sunlight as you could possibly get on the planet.
What does that tell us?
Well, it tells us, as I said, how arrogant we are about thinking, oh, well, we know everything about the planet and we understand everything. And it just amuses me no end. But of course, the problem is that that arrogance is used to then tell people, oh, well, this is the end of the world and this is happening, and oh, the extinction of species, when we don't even know, almost 60% of them haven't even been found or identified.
I've got to tell you something very serendipitous that happened to have occurred this morning. I saw somebody on Facebook that is affiliated with a nonprofit organization. They do a lot of work with organic farming. So I invited them on to talk about their work with organic farming. I always have a pre-production call with all my guests. Therefore, I take notes, I write the context, plus going to their website and reading their books, etc. But anyway, she starts to talk about how they have this correction having to do with farming to get rid of CO2 and to take care of climate change. And I chuckled and I said, I don't see that any of that as a problem. And I'm very interested in your other work. I've done about 300 hours of my own due diligence about this. And climate change is a cycle, and I'm comfortable with it as a cycle. And I've looked at every facet of the wheel of this. And I used to be a zealot like you, and I'm not. And I'm educated now about it, and I'm listening clearly in full context. And she said to me, we don't have the same worldview, and I don't think I can do the show with you. I said, why? She goes, because I don't really know what I'm getting myself into. Obviously, we don't see the same thing. I said, we don't have to see the same thing for you to be a guest on my show. I don't have to agree with you on everything. I mean, that's not a problem. I just wanted you to know where I'm at right now based on the groundwork and the research I've done. And I've really rolled up my sleeves, and I had my blinders on before. So I'm happy to talk about, you want to talk about this, that, the other, whatever. Anyway, she said she doesn't want to be on the show, and that if she did, she'd get back to me. And I find it interesting. And I said, we don't have to agree on everything for you to make a contribution and share about what your organization does. But it's so interesting how a person would take a step back, disassociate, because someone doesn't see exactly what they see. And they would take all the other realms in which they're contributing off the table to share with the public, because God forbid they're talking to somebody that sees something differently in a different context and paradigm than the way they're looking at it. I just found it was interesting.
Well, it's enormously interesting, and of course, you and I have talked off the air and on the air about all we've ever really asked for is a dialogue and a debate over these issues. And if you're not willing to debate and you reject somebody because there's one thing that they don't agree with you, I think that's so completely against advancing understanding and advancing knowledge and people coming together and resolving issues and so on. I couldn't agree with you more.
It was, of course, I've been through it with people in completely different fields than anything having to do with climate. So I'm used to it, but every time it happens, and it happens intermittently and every so often, I'm stunned. Like, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? You're not capable of having a conversation about your particular offering because one part of what you're trying to accomplish, I don't agree with your paradigm or your research or your details on it. Who cares? You're still a guest.
Right.
You're still invited to speak your mind and speak your experience and speak your view. No one's cutting you off, but oh my God. So when she said to me, well, we don't see the world the same way. I said, how do you know how I see the world? You don't even know me. You haven't spent even 5 minutes talking to me. And it doesn't matter that I love the oceans, that I love land, that I love the mountains, that I love clean air, that I love clean water, that I love animals and people, and I'm for clean agriculture and clean forest. And it's ridiculous.
Yeah, but you know, Kim, one of the things where I confront this in climate every once in a while is that people ask about things like the groundhog, and and of course a lot of people dismiss that, and particularly so-called modern-day science. That this is the reality is that the groundhog is based on empirical observations of people and farmers over hundreds of years. And one of the things that amused me is that the Aboriginals across northern Canada, the Dene and the Cree and the Inuit peoples, use the northern lights to forecast the weather. And they get surprisingly accurate forecasts with that. Our own official government, Environment Canada, says, oh, it's all rubbish. It has nothing to do with the weather. Yet now, of course, we know that the northern lights are related to sunspots and related to changes in solar activity and so on and so forth. So one of the things that I've learned, and by the way, we should do a whole program on weather folklore.
That would be great. That'd be fascinating.
Right, and because and by the way, the groundhog thing, just to finish that briefly, that actually started in Russia where they used the badger. And in parts of Europe, they used the badger. But when they came to North America, of course, they didn't have a badger, so they substituted the groundhog. And it's based on that middle latitude observations. But one of the things that I've learned is not to discard anything out of hand. That everything bears some examination, and that you're really just being prejudicial when you take that kind of attitude and approach to things.
Well, also, when you're doing an intake to do an interview or to have a broadcast discussion, it was proper for me to say, you know what? I don't see it that way. I see it as a cycle. There's no problem talking about it. I wanted to be clear that based on my 300 hours of research, I'm clear that it's a cycle. I don't feel like there's anything to stop. You know from my shows that I'm for the responsible use of the environment. I'm for stewardship of the environment. I don't like pollutants. I don't like unnecessary chemicals that are toxic, but that's for everything. And so what? And all of a sudden, it's bizarre.
Yeah. But that's part of this modern mentality that if you're not with me, you must be against me. And we see it in politics. We see it in every aspect of today's life. And it's so divisive, that approach to things. And of course, you also see it in the whole environmental movement, that if you dare to question any part of it, you're immediately in favor of pollution and not caring about the environment. And so people, then you actually see them on television. It says underneath environmentalist. Well,
do you know what she said to me? So you don't agree with the 20,000 scientists that represent the IPCC? I said, I'm not going to get into a long pre-production conversation with you. You're welcome to listen to my 15 plus shows on climate. It really does involve a commitment to the whole caboodle, the whole thing, not just what one scientist said or 20,000 feel pressure to say, or who in academia is being bought. one thing I did say to her, I said, you need to be willing to be a student and to be wrong. And until you're willing to be wrong, you're not approachable and you're not going to learn anything. What you're doing is operating an agenda instead of really being excited to learn and to see. Because when I came to the subject of climate, I was absolutely unwilling before I did my first show. And only because I was doing my first show did it cause me to roll up my sleeves, forget what I had ingested after all those years, and be willing to look and read and ask the questions and meet the people and bring people together and look at a whole systems approach to what is this?
But of course, one of the things that's happening is that, first of all, where we mentioned the environmental movement, it's become the new religion. And science has become, and we could talk about this at some point on a program, but science, in defeating religion, has become more dogmatic than the religion it replaced. And of course, the problem with religions is that there's a point at which it's a blind faith.
Exactly.
And that's the danger with what's going on with her response to you. And
yeah. And the thing is, it's not about fighting over it. The thing is, if somebody said to me, the 15 shows that you did and all the people that you interviewed and all these key pieces, et cetera, that were discussed, I have something that will derail all that, or all that is whatever. I might be willing to listen, even though I wouldn't necessarily at first accept that, because I love to learn and I'm receptive. But when I look into the conditions for transmitting accurate information to the public, and I look at what's happening to the public and how the public is being hypnotized by the mainstream media networks and the agenda and the propaganda, it's so pervasive. When you have to take over the entire media to drive an agenda, to me, that's devilishness at foot. And then to be able to hijack almost the entire environmental movement and completely hypnotize us so that we can't separate the wheat from the chaff. Now that is a slick agenda. That is slick.
Yes.
That is devilishness. That is some slick stuff. But I'll tell you, I never thought in a million years, Tim, that I would stand up and say, I've looked at every aspect of this. These are the areas that are incomplete information being delivered to the public, and stand and say it. And yet, I'm not involved in politics, and I don't want to be involved in politics. But when I hear people getting scared and freaked out, the seas are rising to the nth degree, all they remember is Al Gore's movie, the ocean's getting higher and higher and higher. And I'm not saying that we're not going to have some type of major weather changes in the next 20, 25 years, or more earthquakes and more volcanoes and, a lot of complexity around the world. But the scare that has been transmitted, the fear, propaganda is so huge. It's so unbelievable. And I'll tell you what, I'll bet you a lot of wonderful people, good-hearted people that are tuned in, bought it just like me.
Let's flip that back to the oceans again, because and the fact, as you mentioned, that Gore, with those computer animations of Florida going underwater and New York City going underwater, although some might think that's a good idea, urban renewal, but there's a reason why he made that such a big part of his movie, because people are afraid of the oceans generally. When you think of the tsunamis,
absolutely,
and people's fear of drowning, we generally we have a deep respect for water,
and there's mystery to it too, don't you think?
Oh, a huge mystery,
tremendous mystery,
huge mystery. Yeah. And I mean, if you think about them setting off from Europe or wherever they did, even on the Kon-Tiki type rafts and so on. And by the way, there's a wonderful book by Thor Heyerdahl who speaks to all of the things that you and I have just been talking about, and it's called Early Man and the Oceans.
Oh, that'd be a great book.
Now Heyerdahl is a great hero of mine in that not only for the Kon-Tiki expedition, where he had a hypothesis and he went out and tested it, put his life on the line on that balsa raft, but his idea about early man in the oceans is the argument that people have been on the oceans and taking great long voyages for much longer than history allows. And of course, it's been it's been dismissed, and Heyerdahl generally has been dismissed. Why? Because he doesn't have any degrees. He doesn't fit into that academic thing. Oh, you've got to have peer-reviewed papers to even entertain a new idea or have a new idea. But in Early Man in the Oceans, he presents some very, very convincing evidence of how people moved around the oceans, particularly with the distribution of certain animals and plants. For example, the distribution of the sweet potato, and the distribution of pigs, and the distribution of red hair around the world. And these things raise all sorts of interesting questions, and he's basically arguing that when you start to look at the pattern of ocean currents and how people would move with those ocean currents, then it starts to make some sense. And the red hair one is particularly interesting, and some of this is now being confirmed with DNA tracing and so on. But the ocean currents, of course, are what people are familiar with to some extent. But they actually the surface ocean currents only operate in the top approximately 3,000 feet of water, and they are driven by the winds. And there is a distinct pattern to them, and of course they have a huge influence on regional climates. And for example, and you've got this going on now with talk about the oil coming out of the Gulf and getting into the Gulf Stream.
And I'd like you to talk about that when you get to it. I'd really like you to say some things about what your perspective is on what's going on from the oceanic level, when you can.
Yeah, well, and of course the transport of that heat energy from and people incorrectly say, oh, the Gulf Stream goes to the western part of Europe. It doesn't. It's only the Gulf Stream as it comes out of the Gulf and then moves up the eastern seaboard of the United States. But once it gets off the coast of Cape Cod and on eastern Canada, it is then driven by the westerly winds and becomes the North Atlantic Drift, which is the proper term for it. And this is one of the greatest movements of water and energy anywhere on the planet. It's huge. And I just tell an interesting little story about this. We were sent out very early one morning in our aircraft, our anti-submarine aircraft, because a Canadian Navy had lost two pilots in a survival dinghy. What they were doing was doing ocean survival training, and they put these two pilots into this rubber dinghy, put them over the side of the destroyer, and when the sun rose in the morning, they were gone. And of course, there was a big panic, and the reason was because the destroyer was holding its position using GPS and staying in one place, whereas the dinghy was at the mercy of the Gulf Stream, the North Atlantic Drift there, and was being carried towards Europe at about 12 knots. And they didn't allow for this. And of course, they had no idea that it would travel that far in that short a time. Now, by the way, Benjamin Franklin understood this, and I might have mentioned this before, but it's worth commenting again about people with much wider understanding of things, which makes them great leaders and great visionaries. But Franklin, who was the first postmaster general, wanted to speed up mail traveling between France and the U.S. because of the Revolutionary War, and he gave the ship's captains carrying the post thermometers, so that they could travel with the North Atlantic Drift going to Europe and avoid it coming back to the Americas.
Oh, interesting.
And that speeded up the rate of mail delivery by 5 full days, which is, as I said, it's a measure of why he is such a remarkable man in history. But of course, this is, as I say, what makes visionaries and these people so great. But it's an awareness of nature in the oceans. And so the surface currents are very important. But just to give you an idea of how recent our understanding of all of these currents are, even during my career, once I got into the university in the late 69 and 70, they were starting to talk about something called the Walker circulation. This is a New Zealand scientist who was looking at the fact that there appeared to be a pattern to the pressure and the winds in the subtropics around New Zealand. And he proposed this idea of the ocean currents in the subtropics in the Pacific reversing themselves, that the water was flowing in one direction at one time and then flowing in the opposite direction at another time. Now this, of course, gradually over time, it became known as the El Nino effect, and now it's known as ENSO, or the El Nino Southern Oscillation. But now, that's only come into the modern scientific literature since about 1970. But here's the amusing thing about it, Kim, is that when Sir Francis Drake set off on his voyage around the world, and he got around Cape Horn and into the Pacific as the first British sailor to do that, the very first thing he did was captured a Spanish vessel and took on the navigator from that Spanish vessel to help him cope with these different currents, the El Nino currents in the Pacific Ocean. And the Spanish knew about them, and of course that's where the name came from, El Nino, the Christ child, because they occur around Christmas time. And also, of course, the Spanish learned about them from the Inca, who were sailing their rafts to the Galapagos, and they knew there were periods of time when they simply couldn't overcome and get out to the islands off the coast of South America because the winds and the currents had reversed themselves. So we're back to almost to Thor Heyerdahl, an early man in the oceans, and so on. So what we're seeing is that primitive peoples, in many ways, had a better and more empirical understanding of things, and that somehow, because we're now discovering it scientifically, that this is something new. And of course, it's made even worse because a lot of people think, oh, well, El Nino, that's something that's being caused by humans because it's just been recently discovered. It's absolute nonsense. And there are marvelous records of reconstructing El Nino events going back 300, 400, 500 years, but of course they go much longer than that. And by the way, another example of the relationship between these oceans and the ocean currents and the weather was that the potato was the primary crop, the basic food supply for the Inca people. And, of course, when to plant that potato crop was critical because of the rainfall patterns on the coast of South America. So what would happen is every spring, the leaders, the priests, and so on would go up into the high mountains, and they would make observations of a group of stars called the Pleiades, and depending upon whether the Pleiades were sparkling or twinkling, or whether they were very clear, they would then make a call and say, okay, we'll plant the potatoes early, or no, we'll delay the planting, because they knew by experience that the atmospheric conditions were telling them whether there was going to be an early rainfall or a late rainfall. What they didn't know, of course, was that what was causing the changing view of the Pleiades was changing of the optic conditions of the atmosphere because of the El Nino, La Nina reversal of currents and the temperatures and the heat rising and so on. So these interconnections are just amazing historically when you start to dig into them. But as I said, here we are arrogantly thinking, oh, well, we've got satellites up there and we know all about the oceans and we know all about what's going on, and nothing could be further from the truth.
Do you remember when we were preparing to do the show on peer review that you had talked about, was it you that talked about Sir Francis Drake, that there was new information about him? Is that something you can share right now or not really?
Yeah, very quickly. Francis Drake, of course, and by the way, I would love to do a program with you on Elizabeth I, who I happen to think is, without question, the greatest leader of all time in any country. The only person I would put even close to her is Catherine the Great. And Catherine, of course, had the disadvantage of being a foreigner in the Russia that she was trying to run. But Elizabeth I, her vision of an awareness of the world was absolutely remarkable. And she, in fact, had a John Dee, who was one of her science advisors, draw a map of the world looking down on the North Pole. And I mean, it's the most remarkable thing that you can imagine here in the 16th century. Here's a map, and you show it to modern people, and they can't see what they're looking at because it's a view of the world they don't see. To them, the North Pole is simply a line across the top of a map,
exactly.
the same length as the equator.
Talk about
and that, by the way, is well, exactly. But anyway, Elizabeth, of course, wanted to find the Northwest Passage, which was a way around the top of America. And of course, this search had been going on, really started with her and Martin Frobisher looking from the eastern end, but she sent Drake to find the Northwest Passage from the western end. Now, very few history books even talk about this. I mean, all of the focus is on the eastern side, but Drake's directions under secret orders, and they were secret orders, was to find the western end. And so Elizabeth then gave him secret orders, and he sailed north on this coast of the Americas, and that was why when he took on that Spanish navigator, the navigator took him out into the about 1,000 miles off the coast of the Americas, and then brought him back in order to deal with the ocean currents. And of course, his first landfalls are on the west coast of what is now British Columbia. And he then sailed up the northwest coast here. Now, I got involved in this because there was a fellow who was really interested in Drake and what he was doing in this part of the world. But the problem they had was that when Drake got back to England, and of course Elizabeth, being the clever person that she was, put it out that Drake was a pirate, and she really had no control on him, which is absolute nonsense. Drake was an incredibly well-educated man and very, very knowledgeable, spoke a couple of languages, as Elizabeth did. Elizabeth spoke at least 5 languages, including Welsh and Greek and Latin. And but anyway, so Drake was sent by her to find this northwest end. He then, once he'd found what he thought was the Northwest Passage on this end, it's the Sikine River. It doesn't actually go right through. But he was then also had to do his round-the-world trip. So he set off on that. When he got back to England, Elizabeth met him on board the ship, ordered him not to land at Plymouth, ordered him directly to London, and went on board, and she had the French ambassador with her, which was done deliberately because she knighted him. But the reason she had the French ambassador on board was because Philip of Spain was very angry at what Drake was doing of plundering his gold and so on. And in a very typical Elizabeth move, she said, look, the king wants his gold back, and I'm going to give it to him, but, I don't know how much gold you've got. In other words, you take what you want and we'll give the rest of it back to him. But she also took all of his charts and graphs and records, logbooks, and the logbooks were then altered for this west side of North America. And what they did was they they changed it by 10 degrees of latitude because she didn't want the Spanish to know how far north Drake had actually traveled on this west coast. And so, as I said, that story in itself is one of the most incredible stories about learning about the world. And of course, what Elizabeth's objective was geopolitical, because she realized if she could control the Northwest Passage, she could then control the North Atlantic, and she could control the North Pacific, because the more southerly latitudes had already been ceded to Spain and Portugal. And if she controlled the North Atlantic and the North Pacific, she effectively controlled the Northern Hemisphere. part of this is that they were also looking for a way around the top of Russia. In other words, a northeast passage. And there's quite a few records of ships that got lost on those kinds of things. But these were attempts to try and understand the world, to map the world, and to get a better understanding of the whole ocean. And of course, nobody better for that task than Sir Francis Drake.
Now, was this new information you found out about Sir Francis Drake? Is this that gentleman who wrote the new book on Sir Francis Drake?
Yes, well, it was Sam. Sam Balfe was the author of the book, and of course his concern, and this is what we talked about in that book on peer review, was that Sam has no degrees. And the prevailing historical wisdom is that Drake landed and discovered San Francisco, and there's no evidence to support that at all. In fact, one of the greatest hoaxes in West Coast history is that a plaque was found, supposedly left by Drake, but it was actually a forgery done to fool the academics. And of course, Sam was, as he dug into this, and he really did his homework. For example, one of the critical things was that Drake, frustrated by, here he thought he found the Northwest Passage, which he considered a more important discovery for his career than making a trip around the world, because Magellan had already done that.
Apparently, I'm sorry to interrupt you here, got to cut in. Apparently, from my last interview with Gavin Menzies regarding the book 1434, he even is saying that the European Renaissance, that all these guys had maps already. They had Chinese maps. And anyway, you should hear that one. And the public, I want to tell you, you should hear the show that Dr. Tim Ball and I did with Gavin Menzies, who wrote 1421 and 1434 on peer review. Very important to open up the realm of discovery and to enhance more exploration and to open up receptivity to new discoveries. It's a really important show to listen to. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, well, and of course, one of the things we didn't mention on that program, we should mention now, is that having this information of where to sail and directions and so on, and sharing that information and the charts was very, very, very important and powerful knowledge to have. In fact, one of the interesting the biography, or I think one of the best biographies on Columbus, was done by Samuel Eliot Morison. Now, he was an American admiral, a very famous admiral in the Second World War, who became a historian after the war, and particularly on marine exploration, and wrote, I think, as I say, the definitive biography on Columbus. And one of the stories in that is that Columbus, there was a guy who reportedly knew about where to go and what was beyond the Azores and out into the Atlantic Ocean, and that this guy was a guest at Columbus's house for a weekend, and then he died of food poisoning while he was there. And the suspicion is that Columbus got the information from him and then bumped him off. Now, that's say, a suspicion and speculation. But the fact that Elizabeth swore Drake to secrecy is very important. And by the way, another measure of how this information was shared, when Cook came to the west coast of North America 200 years after Drake, he clearly was given information on what Drake had discovered. He was clearly given directions and information. And of course, now we're back to the story about Drake being frustrated by wanting to get credit for what he'd done. And after Elizabeth swore him to secrecy, he took off to Europe and met with the world's top map maker at that time, and gave him all the information that he had, so that the map maker, within months of Drake's visit, produced a whole new map of the world that showed islands off the west coast. So in other words, Drake was saying, well, I'm not giving any secrets away, but, and by the way, it's called the French map, and there's a picture of Drake on it. But one of the critical things with that, Kim, was that Drake had used a method of determining longitude. That was done long before the Harrison chronometer and all of those sorts of things. And in the new map that was produced after Drake's visit, the west coast of North America was shifted 60 degrees further west to its approximate or accurate location. And I mean, you don't do that if you haven't got immediate, accurate information.
That's why it's so exciting to be part of revisionist history, because we actually get to go back and look and ask the question instead of just ingesting information like automatons.
Yeah, well, of course, somebody once said that the history is written by the victors, and
I think that's true.
You get the. I had a debate with somebody about that the other day when I pointed out. In fact, it was one of our provincial leaders here a few years ago. I had the argument with him, and I said, I would much rather have been a medieval peasant under feudalism than living under your jurisdiction today. And,
God, that's pretty heavy.
Luckily he had a sense of humor, but which is rare for anyway. He said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, we've been led to believe that being a feudal peasant was terrible." But I said, I work for the government 5, almost 6 days of the week. I mean, how long into June or July is it before the money you make is not going to Washington anymore? It's staying in your pocket. And I said, the feudal peasant only had to work 4 days a week on average for the lord of the manor, and got in return for that protection and defense, which of course is what federal governments actually are only all about. But not only that, but the medieval peasant had 100 days of holidays a year.
Let's go to Europe. You get, I think, a month or 6 weeks, isn't it? That's really being human, isn't it?
Yes, of course. But as I say, the medieval peasant got at least 100 days of holidays a year because they were religious holidays. And the lord of the manor didn't dare argue with the church. And so, as I say, when you start to compare things, but we're led to this idea that being a worker in the Industrial Revolution was a much more enlightened and free life than being a medieval peasant, when it's far from the truth.
We're living in a very, very different world today.
Well, exactly, and it's because it's, as I said, it's what they mean when they say the victor's right. We've got to convince ourselves that what we're doing today is far better and superior to anything that went on in the past, and that's not the case at all. But you have to open your mind up, as we were discussing earlier, and start to look at these things from a different perspective. And of course, what happens is, as I say about our education system today, it's not education, it's indoctrination.
That's a really key distinction.
Yeah, and students, once they regurgitate what they've been told, then they're given an A, and the student that dares to question is given a C or an F, or seen as a troublemaker. And I always used to laugh about it. I said my favorite students are the ones that sit in the back row, because they're sitting back there with a cynical ear, and that's what I want in my classroom. And but I used to tell them, don't get too cynical. Just keep it a healthy skepticism, and we can get along.
Why is it that those who roll up their sleeves and do their own investigations and their own research on things, who are dedicated, why are they called skeptics?
Well, there's two answers to that. The first is that if you're a scientist, you are by your very training a skeptic, because a scientist questions everything.
Okay.
But of course, this is one of the things that shows, and the other side of it is how I knew that climate science was now political climate science, because they started labeling me a skeptic. And I said, but all scientists are skeptics. But somehow being a climate skeptic was unacceptable. And of course, it's because you're questioning the prevailing wisdom. You're questioning the power. And you're questioning those people that want to control you with the information that they have.
There's another piece to this, which is that we are supposed to accept what we're being told, but we're told we're deniers. It's kind of like saying so-and-so can't face reality, or you disenfranchise them, or you make them wrong, or you detach from them, disassociate from them. They're crazy. That kind of rhetoric, that kind of communication is totally inappropriate. And the fact that there's no dialogue, that the dialogue is over. There has never been a dialogue yet. And the minute that there is a dialogue and the people come out of hiding about this, believe me, more people are going to question, do their own research instead of blindly going along. Very important. I'd like to talk about the Gulf Coast with you if you have a little more time.
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, just a quick comment about what you just said. It's the marginalizing, because we're the gregarious animal. We are much more comfortable in groups. We want to be part of a group. And of course, if you can marginalize somebody, that shun them from the group. I mean, shunning is one of the most standard techniques of pushing somebody outside and marginalizing them. And of course, we saw that in the climate debate, not only in terms of there's no debate, there's no dialogue, but also in the consensus argument. The consensus argument doesn't work in science. That consensus is not a scientific fact, as I've said many times. But if you could say, well, and as that woman said to you, are you disagreeing with the 20,000 scientists? What she's essentially doing is saying, well, you're marginalized. You're so outside of the group. You can't possibly be right.
But there's more scientists outside the IPCC that totally don't agree with most of what they're saying. And that is never brought to light. Why?
Well, that's never brought to light, but one of the reasons I haven't used it, because, I was one of the first signers of the Oregon petition and all these different petitions, the Heidelberg petition and so on. But the difficulty is that it's not proof either.
Oh, I totally agree with you. It's like having the wrong conversation, because it's not about this versus that. It's about what is the science. What is the purpose of the science?
Yes. And so, you can say, well, there's this many scientists that disagree with the IPCC, but that doesn't make the science any more right or wrong.
That's correct. And that's why I didn't get into the conversation, but I thought it was interesting, because even on that level, it's a non-conversation to be having, really. But you can't know that until you've heard somebody like you and Joe Dalio and Robert Felix talk about all these different areas of what scientists are supposed to do. God, there was a lot of people that I had on who were scientists that talked about how the science has always been done until now it's being critically obstructed. And the whole thing about understanding the difference between simulations and real data, fascinating. Totally different gestalts of information. That's a whole other world.
This whole ocean thing is really speaking to that. Because we know virtually nothing about the oceans, and yet they are essential to understanding the whole atmospheric system, the climate system, the weather patterns we get, and so on. And so when you start to look at, we just talked about the surface currents and so on, but how many people know that that below that approximately 3,000 feet, the ocean circulations are completely different? What you've got is essentially the cold water, the cold, dense water, and in the polar regions sinks because it's cold and dense, and then moves towards the equator where it rises. So it's going in a circulation system that is essentially north-south, whereas most of the ocean currents on the surface are circulating around ocean basins in what are called gyres. And so when we talked about the Gulf Stream and it going up and becoming the North Atlantic Drift, well, that goes up into the Arctic Ocean, but also a large portion of it goes back down along the coast of West Africa and down around and back across the ocean again. So these circulations within each ocean basin, as I said, are called gyres or gyres. That's spelled Gyres. And so you've got two distinctly different patterns of circulation in the ocean, that surface pattern driven by the winds, and then you've got the very deep ocean circulation. And so, of course, what could happen, because water can store heat in very, very large quantities for very long periods of time, you can have heat being stored in that deep ocean current and being within that current and coming back up to the surface and being input to the surface waters, and that could take up to 10,000 years to occur.
What does this mean to us? Explain that.
What it means is that we've talked about the weather is cycles. Climates are cycles. Yeah. Okay. Now, one of the little known, but I think one of the most interesting conferences occurred in 1990 in Warsaw, Poland, where the Soviets, as they were then, were presenting one view of weather and climate, and the Western world, mostly represented by the U.S., were presenting a completely different view. It was seen by outsiders and the media and so on, and totally misunderstood as, oh, this is a political East-West Cold War conflict. It was nothing of the sort. What went on at that conference was it split into the two groups. One was the Eastern Europeans and the Soviets saying that the weather and the climate it goes in cycles. And the Russians, they've been studying cycles. For example, one of the well-known ones in economics is the K cycle, the Kondratiev cycle. They just argue, and I tend to agree with them, that there are just a multitude of cycles that are all interacting with each other and create the net effect, which is the weather. And of course, sorting out the different cycles and how they interact is a hugely complex problem. At that conference, the other view, presented primarily by the U.S., as I said, was that, no, it's chaotic. You can't predict it. It's completely chaotic, and it doesn't work in any predictable patterns or cycles at all. And that's when, of course, the chaos theory was dominating everything in Western science. And by the way, the Chinese were also accepting the Soviet point of view, and I did some work with Chinese climatologists on the ability to increase their food production in northern China and what the weather conditions and climate conditions were like. But they had they had the Soviet view that it was cycles because, of course, they had records of 3,000 years in length that showed them these patterns. And so that 1990 conference, which, as I said, was interpreted as a political split, was in fact a huge academic split. And one of the people that became a victim of this was a fellow by the name of Milutin Milankovic. Now, Milankovic was a Yugoslavian, Serbian, a mathematician, and this is an interesting part of what we're talking about here, this wider global view of things. He was connected with a fellow by the name of Köppen, Vladimir Köppen, Koeppen, who was the first person to come up with a climate classification. That is to identify the different climate classes around the world. In other words, he was looking at a global pattern. He was also working with, and they communicated with each other, and I can't remember exactly, but I believe Köppen, there was a marriage between them. There was a marriage relationship in there. But they were also working with Wegener. Okay, Wegener was the guy that came up with the continental drift theory. That is that the continents were moving and the Earth's crust was plates. And, of course, this was ridiculed and rejected, and now, of course, we know that Alfred Wegener's continental drift theory is at the very basics of geological understanding of the world.
And yet, at that time, he was ridiculed terribly.
Yeah, 1912 was when he came out with that theory. Okay, now Sir Francis Bacon, who was an Elizabethan scientist, he'd noticed that the western part of Europe and Africa fit with the eastern part of North America and South America, but that was just simply a sort of a pattern recognition observation. But these three men were working together. What they were doing was looking at the world on a global basis and looking at the patterns of it. And all three of them had their ideas initially sort of looked at, no, that's interesting, and then totally rejected because they conflicted with the prevailing wisdom of things, and they conflicted with people's view. They said, well, Wegener, for example, how could continents move? That's simply illogical. And
don't you think academia can be very mean? Academia culture can be extremely mean-spirited about information and knowledge.
Oh, the politics of universities, and I've worked in government, I've worked in private industry, I've worked on my own, and I've been an academic. The politics in university are the worst, the most vicious, and I believe it was Enoch Powell said, because they've got nothing better to do with their time than to attack each other. And but it's the most vicious, and there's been several books written about that, about the academic. And of course, as I've always said about universities, and what Prince Philip, who doesn't say very many bright things, but one thing he said was that universities are the only truly incestuous system in our society, that everybody that is in them is a product of them. And of course, the other thing is that your promotion and advancement in the universities is determined by your colleagues. And of course, so what you've got is the prisoners running the prison. It's the most remarkable situation.
Go back to Milankovitch for us.
Yeah, well, Milankovitch, as I said, he was working with Wegener and Köppen, and Köppen's least known of the three, obviously. But Milankovitch came out with his theory in the 1950s, and it was published, and it was generally accepted initially. That people said, well, yeah, this is a very interesting idea. Now, it wasn't new. And what Milankovich's idea was that there were three things that controlled the long-term temperature of the Earth. One was the change in orbit of the Earth around the Sun. And the second was the change of the tilt of the Earth. And the third was what's called the precession of the equinox. This is a change of the date of equinoxes and solstices over a period of time because of the other two changes. Now, we're still teaching in most schools that the orbit of the Earth around the Sun is a fixed elliptical orbit. But we've known for 150 years that that's not true. A Scottish fellow by the name of Cole was studying how changes in the orbit of the Earth, which is caused, by the way, by the gravitational pull of the planet Jupiter, will change the temperature of the Earth because of the orbital changes. And so Milankovitch took that, and he took the tilt change and the precession, and he showed. And by the way, the calculations he did pre-computer was absolutely incredible, because he calculated the amount of energy received from the sun with each of these changes for every 5 degrees of latitude for a period of 400,000 years. It took him 30 years of his life to do these calculations, and his ideas, as I said, it's an incredible piece of work that he did. His ideas were accepted, but then, and I remember this happening, all of a sudden Milankovitch was rejected, completely thrown out. His son later wrote a wonderful article saying his father died of a broken heart because his ideas were rejected. Well, what caused the rejection of his ideas was the introduction of a new technology called radiocarbon dating. And so here was a new technology. Oh, radio, it's carbon. It's, this is very sophisticated and so on. Well, how did this reject Milankovitch? Well, Milankovitch had shown that there was ice in Alaska at a certain time period. And then somebody had got some material and measured the radiocarbon date of it and showed, oh, no, there was a forest in that area at that time. There couldn't have been a glacier there. So because the radiocarbon date showed that there couldn't have been ice when Milankovitch said there was ice. They threw the whole idea out. It turned out later that it was the radiocarbon dating that was wrong. Now, why was it wrong? Because they assumed that the amount of carbon-12 coming out from the sun was constant. And it is anything but constant. It varies all of the time. But of course, we were into that thing that you and I have talked about uniformitarianism. So Milankovitch died, as his son claimed, of a broken heart. And again, to put into perspective how recent all of our understandings of things are, I remember in my early career going to conferences, and I'm talking now in the 1970s and early 80s, where somebody would mention Milankovitch, and immediately there'd be outcries. That charlatan, that crook, that don't mention that name here. And then, as late as the late 1980s, I started going to conferences, and I remember one in Ottawa. And somebody mentioned Milankovitch as a possible explanation for a temperature trend, and nobody questioned it. And now, of course, Milankovitch is generally accepted by almost everybody. And so you see this pattern of people trying to bring new ideas, trying to look at things differently. And you see the problem is not just that the public don't accept them. It's that it's within the academia, it's within the scientific community, within that whole academic community that they're rejected and marginalized and so on. And so that's where the real problem comes. And of course, in the case of the whole global warming due to humans theory, and we have talked about this, was that they took control of the science of it through the IPCC and the focus on CO2 and Maurice Strong and what he did there, and the Climatic Research Unit people whose emails were leaked. They were controlling the science side of it, the peer review process that we talked about. But Maurice Strong then set up the Rio conference in 1992, and that's where the whole Kyoto thing was planned. And there he took it into the public forum, into the political forum, because that's where the NGOs were invited, that's where the environmental groups were invited, and so that's where he took the singular scientific view into the public forum. And of course, the public were then hoodwinked into this whole scam that we have talked about so much going on. But as I said, when you look at these stories of Milankovitch and of Wegener and so on, the struggle to get to the truth and get to understanding is almost always a huge struggle, because you're tackling the people that hold the power, the people that have sold a particular idea to themselves and to the school system and so on. And so to try and overcome that is absolutely a huge problem.
It's very easy for people that care about the planet, have a connection to the planet, are concerned about species and concerned about our environment. It's very, very disconcerting to try to get through the inner workings and the detail of this in such a way that people are clear. And so it's a lot easier to go along, to get along. The peer pressure about this is tremendous. I mean, I can tell you, if I'm doing a show and I've had a handful of people not willing to talk to me and come on as a guest, having nothing to do, by the way, with the climate industry, that's how deep level this is being politicized. That's how governments and elected leaders are dividing people over it. I think that is devilishness, when you can divide populations of people, families, friends, associates, people that are meeting each other who really should be talking about stewardship on all different levels, absolutely divided like as if a religion. That tells me that it's been deeply worked out and politicized. And that's the sad part. And do we let them get away with that? Do we as human beings allow our elected officials and celebrities to be effective at dividing us between believers and deniers? That architecture of conversation is a loser conversation. It's a losing purpose, and it has no leadership to it. When you have to divide people, you actually don't have something solid on the ground. And the other part of this devilishness is that people are being united to save the planet. I think people should be united anyway, as much as they can. But the planet needs help on so many levels from so many people in every area imaginable, from the seeds we use to the food we eat, to the water we drink, to all kinds of things, to the gardens we can't grow anymore, apparently, to the farms that are now being controlled by big companies like Monsanto. So we all need to pull together. But we have had in our consciousness implanted a seed of consciousness that we're not good stewards, that it's not good enough what we're doing, that we're the problem. It's almost as if the leadership has convinced human beings that we're killing the planet. And the fact is that the big companies that think they have the right to stand in our Gulf of Mexico and get away with making our oceans toxic. This is an example, you see. No, it's not the people on the Gulf Coast. It's not they're killing the planet. It's corporations that are given the total leeway to destroy the entire Earth. That is part of the problem. And by the way, I'm a big advocate of non-polluting on everything from the food supply to the water to the air and all of that. And it's interesting that there's still no middle ground. There's no paradigm yet. There's no prepared paradigm for somebody to look into the detail. I've been on a 25-year mission that has absolutely nothing to do with my broadcasting, that has to do with assisting this planet at this time in transition for humanity and the planet. And I'll tell you, there is no way anybody is going to tell me and marginalize me that I don't care. We're not on the same page because we don't care about the same things. You know, most people do care about the same things. Most people do want clean air. They do want clean water. They do want clean food. And they don't want seeds when the molecular structure of food is being completely changed. They don't want to be told they can't grow gardens. It's absurd.
I totally agree with you, but it's one of the challenges that I had in my early days of questioning and challenging the climate thing was people would say, "Oh, well, you're just giving comfort to the polluters," and that really bothered me because I did not want to do that. There are polluters; there's no question about that, and I finally decided, and it was about 15 years ago, that there was a greater danger in misleading people by getting them to think something with false information. Because once they found that out, and inevitably they would find that out, that they would get to the point where they say, well, we don't believe anything you tell us. And we're seeing that now with this whole climate thing. And I think that that's a much greater danger in terms of what's happening. But listen, just to get back to the thing about Tolstoy, here's an interesting quote from Tolstoy. A very fascinating man. He grappled with all of these fundamental things about life and religion and so on. But he wrote, this is 100 years or so ago, he said, "I know that most men, including those at ease with problems of the greatest complexity, can seldom accept even the simplest and most obvious truth, if it be such as would oblige them to admit the falsity of conclusions which they delighted in explaining to colleagues, which they have proudly taught to others, and which they have woven thread by thread into the fabric of their lives."
Wow.
Now, it's a powerful comment on what's going on here. And so, yeah, it's such a challenge to, because, you know, and I've given speeches where people would come up after and say, look, we agree with you, but we're afraid to speak out. And I have some sympathy with that.
Absolutely, I do too.
You've got a mortgage, you've got children, and it's the problem that's going on that Gulf Coast right now, where the people are saying, well, yeah, we don't want the polluting of our Gulf and our waters, but we need the jobs and we need the oil money coming in as well. And of course, one of the things that's interesting, I used to give lectures about a guy by the name of Eric Heilbronner. He was an American economic futurist, and he made the incredible observation, and I believe it was as early as the mid-'70s, and I talked about this in my political geography class. He said that multinationals are going to be the new nation states of the 21st century.
Tragic.
And that that he said that they will not be beholden to anybody, because what they'll do is, if they're operating in your country and you start to impose on them or impinge on them too much, they simply pick up and move to some other part of the world that's desperate for the work that they bring and desperate for the money that they bring. And I've watched this with INCO, International Nickel. And of course, one of the things that's happening with the BP in the Gulf is that they're heavily involved with George Soros and Obama, with Petrobras down in Brazil.
I heard that there was a transaction or something. There was some investment like weeks before.
Yeah, what happened was that Soros bought into Petrobras, which is the government-run oil industry in Brazil, and he did it 2 months before they announced that they discovered a very, very large deposits of oil in deep waters off the coast of Brazil. And then shortly after that, Obama advanced $2 billion credit to Petrobras to develop this oil. But of course, their problem is that there is a very limited number of deep water drilling rigs, most of them tied up in the Gulf of Mexico. And of course, what better way to make them available to Brazil than to declare a moratorium on drilling in the Gulf? So what you've got is machinations within machinations going on here, and it goes back to Heilbronner's argument about these multinationals effectively not being beholden to any nation and therefore any people, because they simply pick up and move if they don't like the way that you're running them or telling them to run.
Well, listen, I want to talk about the EPA for a minute. I think it's very important, because I was always under the impression as a younger person that the EPA was honest, was a do-gooder, was here to protect us, etc. If the EPA can declare carbon dioxide a toxin in December of 2009, and if the EPA can allow BP to put Corexit, millions upon millions of gallons of Corexit in the ocean, people are so sick and so many animals have died, how come they're able to do it? I don't get it. I thought they're supposed to protect us.
Well, one of the things that is that if you want to, one of the difficulties with democracy is you have elections, and you're answerable to the people. So you have to find a way to get around that. And of course, one way that you do it is that you function and operate through bureaucracies, through executive orders, and of course that's one of the things that Gordon Brown did it in Britain. He simply bypassed the political processes completely. And one way you do it, of course, is expand the number of people working in the bureaucracy. Brown added 3 million people to the civil service, as they call it in Britain. And, of course, you're seeing that with so many of the jobs that are being created under Obama. And so if you can bypass the legislative process and do things through the bureaucracy, you can effectively control. Now, I wrote an article almost 2 years ago saying that Obama didn't care about getting cap and trade through. Yes, he'd like the revenue from it. It was going to bring him $500 billion in revenue. But what was more important was the controlling of the fossil fuels and the CO2 and so on. And when the EPA ruled that, and I agree with you, by the way, and this is always the problem with anything, when it's set up for particular reasons, but then it evolves over time. And I think what we need to do is every 2 years go back and look at whatever we've set up and say, is it doing what it was originally intended to do? Has it drifted? Is the drift logical? If not, let's push it back to what it was intended to do. The EPA is one of these examples. But anyway, the EPA maneuvered the Supreme Court into making a ruling on CO2. And Justice Scalia said, look, to say this is a pollutant or a toxin is just ludicrous. flies in the face of logic completely. But nonetheless, the Supreme Court did rule that. And of course, it was precisely what the EPA wanted, because once it was ruled a pollutant, then they had total control over it.
Look what's happening to the light bulbs now. They're telling us we have to use mercury-laden light bulbs. Is that absurd?
Yes, and by the way, there is a solution to that problem, because liquid or light-emitting diodes will replace all light bulbs if government would get out of the way, and if it was allowed to develop. You see this, by the way. People can drive around, see the traffic lights are different. And if you look at the traffic lights closely, you'll see they're quite different in their structure and form, because they're no longer a green piece of glass with a regular light bulb behind it. They're made up of light-emitting diodes, and they burn virtually no power. They give off virtually no heat because they're not burning that power, and they don't burn out. And the problem has been that they haven't been able to produce a white light which has the full range of color spectrum in it up to this point. But they now have a white light emitting diode available, but bulbs made of it are about $45. And yet, if we switch to those, probably reduce the power consumption by at least 50%, because most of the power we use goes to lighting in that form, and of course it would reduce the heat output. But anyway, back to the EPA. Once they had CO2 declared a pollutant, then the next phase they had to go through, and again, this is because of the way the Founding Fathers set up the Constitution and so on, and the amendments have been made since, was that people could challenge what was going on and what the EPA were proposing, and the EPA had to prove that what they were doing would do no harm. And so there were several submissions made legally, and I happened to be part of one of them. And part of what I put in, Kim, and you'd love this, is I said, look, I want power of attorney on behalf of the plants to vote for an increase of CO2.
Talk about that, because I think people are under the false impression about CO2. Say what it is.
Well, CO2 is one of the greenhouse gases. It's less than 4%, but it's essential to life on the planet, because where we breathe in oxygen and breathe out CO2 and other gases, the plants breathe in CO2 and breathe out oxygen. And so without CO2, there are no plants on the planet, and therefore there's no oxygen, there's no life. And at 385 parts per million, which is what they're claiming the current level is, that's the lowest in the last 600 million years. That over the last 300 million years, the average CO2 in the atmosphere has been between 1,000 and 1,200 parts per million. And so they're essential to life. Or it's essential to the plants and therefore to life. And one of the things that the reason we know about the 1,000 to 1,200, by the way, is work by Craig and Idso and his son Sherwood, who've tested all kinds of plants and showed that they grow 4 to 6 times more vigorously and use less water with more CO2. And commercial greenhouses around the world are pumping in those levels of CO2 to increase their productivity. And so at 385, CO2 atmospheric levels are very, very low. If you go down to 250, plants start to die, and at 150 parts per million, the plants basically die. And so this argument that CO2 as a pollutant is only based upon the false claim that it's causing global warming. In fact, it's absolutely essential to life on the planet. And so we submitted this as part of the brief, and I think it's sad to me that we had to do this even in a legal brief, almost tongue in cheek, saying, well, we want to vote on behalf of the plants. And of course, what happened yesterday was that the EPA rejected all of the legal challenges. And of course, what's interesting to me is that they are the ones that did the review and rejected the challenges. It should be an independent agency. But they looked at it and said, no, these are all wrong. We're going to go ahead with it. And what you've got now is the EPA have the authority that Lisa Jackson, Obama's appointee, and her staff can go into any operation and say, you're exceeding what we consider acceptable levels of output of CO2, and we're shutting you down. And it's authoritarianism without control by our representatives and for the public that it just...
Even with all that happening, we're now seeing what the EPA is really about in the Gulf Coast. It couldn't be more evident, the farce that it is what's going on the Gulf Coast.
As you're saying, what they're showing is that it's purely political. They're saying, oh, well, we're saving the planet from global warming. Meanwhile, they're approving things that suit them. You know the one word that people, regardless of what issue it is, the one word or thing that drives people mad is hypocrisy. And that's what we're seeing here, the hypocrisy of it. And it's just so blatant the way they're doing it that it's really frightening.
You're an advisor to the International Climate Science Coalition and also to Friends of Science and the Frontier Center for Public Policy. You've been accused on Wikipedia and I think other SourceWatch of, quote, being funded by big oil, or you're on SourceWatch because you're, quote, a denier. What is the issue about funding in anything you've been involved in? What is the issue?
Okay, what the issue is, and by the way, I've never received a nickel from any energy company at all. In fact, I joke about I wish I had received some from the oil companies because then I could afford their product. But of course, this is the idea of it's part of the ad hominem or personal attacks, that somehow if you're being paid by the oil companies, that's corrupt. But if you're being paid by government, that's not directed funding. Or if an environmental group is getting money from the oil companies, that's okay. So, for example, here in Canada, we've got the Suzuki Foundation, which is a big environmental group. They're receiving money from the oil companies. But somehow that's okay, but the intimation that I'm getting money from the oil companies damns everything I have to say. But to answer your question, about 10 years ago now, a group of professional people, and by that I mean geologists, hydrologists, sedimentary petrology, you name it, we're looking at the science of climate change and climatology and realized that it was just very, very bad science, not only in terms of what they were saying, but the way that they were doing it. And so they contacted me, a fellow by the name of Albert Jacobs, and he said, we want to set up a group, and we want to call it Friends of Science, and we'd like some help. So I met with them in Calgary, and of course their problem was they were in Calgary and Alberta, and of course that in Canada automatically makes you suspect, because of course Alberta is the source of the tar sands and oil and so on. And so they said, look, how can we set this up to focus only on the science? We don't want to get involved in the politics at all. So I talked about what they needed to do, and I said, one of the things you must do is make sure that your funding is at arm's length and that you have nothing to do with it. And it's kept at arm's length. So they set up, through the University of Calgary, a funding process that anybody that submitted funds or gave them money, send it to this blind trust at the University of Calgary. And it subsequently turned out that one oil company had given $12,000 to this blind trust. And, of course, that was disclosed through the, which is fine. I have no problems with that. And then they said, oh, well, because of that money, that means that Tim Ball is paid by the oil companies. And then I traveled to Ottawa we held a press conference on the day that the government was going to announce the Kyoto Protocol signing of it to say, look, we're a bunch of climate scientists who have never been consulted by the Canadian government. We oppose this. And it was claimed that my expenses, which amounted to about $800 airfare and hotel, was paid by the oil company and Friends of Science. In fact, it wasn't at all. And so that then became the argument that you see now in SourceWatch, and it came, by the way, through that Suzuki Foundation and a thing called Dismogblog, which they set up to smear people, and so that was used then to say that I'm totally discredited because I'm paid directly by the oil companies and I'm associated with the oil companies and so on. Nothing could be further from the truth. But
it is what happens when you step out and you don't toe the line. I really appreciate you coming on the show. This has been like a 98-minute show right now. And I'd like to ask you, is there anything else you'd like to share with us?
Well, there's so much else I'd love to talk about the world, about the people in it. I mean, I mentioned Elizabeth I. I'd love to talk to you about William Bligh, Captain Bligh, who is probably one of the most maligned people in the world. He's unquestionably one of the great navigators of history. He took a trip in a 21-foot boat with 19 people in it, where they got 2 ounces of bread a day, and sailed 4,000 miles across the open ocean without any maps, without any navigational help at all, and landed within 12 miles of his destination on the Great Barrier Reef. And that's got completely forgotten because of the mutiny on the Bounty. And the mutiny on the Bounty would never have occurred if he had not been required to build a greenhouse to carry the breadfruit that he was taking to create a reliable food supply for people in different islands. And that greenhouse was built where the Marines would normally be housed. And the Marines were on board not only as a shore raiding party, but to prevent mutinies. But how does Hollywood deal with it? Well, Bligh is played by Charles Lawton in the most ugly presentation you could ever imagine. And Fletcher Christian, who was actually to blame for the whole thing, is played by Errol Flynn, Clark Gable, Mel Gibson. I mean, it's just incredible bias and rewriting of history. And of course, it's what we talked about earlier, about how you want to see things in a certain way, whether it's current information or historical information, and you do these stories to slant the whole story. But I'd love to talk more about that later on.
We'll definitely have you back on. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been talking to Dr. Tim Ball. He is a renowned environmental consultant and former climatology professor at the University of Winnipeg. He's also an advisor to the International Climate Science Coalition, Friends of Science, and the Frontier Center for Public Policy. He's also a writer on Canada Free Press at canadafreepress.com. And I really want to thank you for a wild and extensive journey on this broadcast. We've talked about so many subjects that I don't even know what to write about regarding what it is about. And I really want to thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Kim. And it is the great it's a wandering around the great human adventure on this planet.
Indeed, it's a great honor.